Welcome to another lecture of Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. This lecture we're going to continue talking about Laurence Ralph's Renegade Dreams. And just to recap, right, in this book, Ralph is talking about injuries and how they affect the futures of young men, in particularly young men in Eastwood. Ralph argues that injury can be found not only in the body, right, but also in buildings, in the lack of jobs, in poor housing, due to gentrification, in poor infrastructure. All of these things combined can be seen as a form of injury. And he wants to say that living through injury also changes how people dream, right? So he compares these sort of big dreams, right? These dreams that affect all of society, thinking specifically about Martin Luther King Jr. and Barack Obama, and he compares their dreams for reform, right, to change society, with these other ordinary dreams, like just buying a pair of Jordans. That he wants to say that injury produces these more quote unquote ordinary dreams. Yet he also wants to emphasize, right, that even if injury is not only seen in the body, it also appears in the body, and it appears in the body in very specific ways, right? So although the media tends to associate gun and gang violence with death, most victims of gun violence in Chicago and in a lot of parts of the world, they don't die, they become disabled. So in Chicago, gun violence is the primary cause of disability among the African American and the Latinx community. When we think about increased gun violence related to increased accessibility to guns, we can see that this is something that happens in different places, right? So it's not exclusively of the US, but rather is talking about larger structures that make guns available to people. And in this particular setting, Ralph wants to talk about how being injured while gangbanging can also be a sign of courage, right? So you go to the hospital and you receive this bracelet that says that you were admitted, right? And all of this experience of being in the hospital because you were injured while you were working, doing this labor for a particular gang, that can be a kind of service, a kind of courage, similar to the way in which we think about, for example, the military. And one thing that's important to highlight in this particular reading of disability is this idea that disability is not only the closing of possibilities, but rather the opening up of new ways of seeing the world, right? And it allows for an alternative take on gang violence, right? And this is why a lot of disabled gang members, maybe not a lot, but some disabled gang members then become anti-violence, anti-gang activists, because they have been disabled and because they use their bodies as the message and as the messenger. So Laurence Ralph analyzes disability using these two angles: the medical and social model of disability. Those are two different forms to think about disability, and the debt obligation, right? Going back to ideas about Moss and the gift. When we think about the medical model of disability, it's important to think about the way in which the medical science, in particular the medical establishment, is often thinking about illness or disability as a result of a physical condition that is intrinsic to the individual, and that it may reduce the individual's quality of life and cause disadvantages, right? So this is solely sort of looking at individual bodies and thinking that specific bodies have to be able to perform X amount of functions, right? And this is where it'll get complicated in a little bit. So specific bodies need to perform X amount of functions, right? And if something happens to those bodies and these bodies can no longer perform that particular amount of functions, then that means there's something wrong with their bodies, right? But the social model of disability is a reaction to this way to think about disability, right? And people who espouse the social model of disability, they want to say the body is not a machine to be fixed, right? There is no such thing as a particularly number of functions that a body has to produce. Rather, society has created these functions and then later imposed these functions on everyone, right? And those bodies that cannot perform these functions are seen as disabled, right? So rather than thinking that disability is coming from the body, the social model of disability wants to say that disability is produced through systemic social barriers and attitudes, right? So when we think about, for example, why is it that going up the stairs becomes this function, right? Is this something that belongs, that we could blame individual bodies for not being able to do this, or does this have to do with the way in which we thought about housing, with the ways in which we have designed buildings, with the need to stack different apartments in this particular way, right? And again, right, if you, for example, if for any reason you're not able to go up the stairs, and then you're disabled. But if you're wealthy and you have an elevator, a lift, then you're that doesn't interfere, right? So there's also this aspect of class that we need to account for. So for the social model of disability, right, disability is produced not by an individual body, not because of an individual body, but by the social environment. The social model of disability also questions some of the ethical and technical approaches used by MDs, right? Symptoms and diagnosis often isolates the parts of the body. So when you go to the doctor, the question that a doctor will ask you is, where does it hurt, right? Because it seems more like this machine that has to be fixed. It doesn't, the other social aspects don't really matter, right? Rather, it matters where it hurts, and then to isolate that particular pain, that particular issue, and then to fix it. And in the same way, right, although this might be changing in some ways, diseases are seen as biological, but they also continue to isolate the individual from the social group. And what happens here is that the patient often has to believe in or to surrender to the doctor, creating these unequal relationships between patients and MDs. When Ralph talks specifically about disability in Eastwood, he's talking about this collective, the Crippled Footprint Collective, a group of former gangbangers who have become disabled because of gun violence, and he is looking particularly at Justin, who uses his body as a way to get his message across, right? So he wants to say that in some way, Justin and the Crippled Footprint Collective move away from this medical model of disability and draw attention to their own broken bodies as a political act that is meant to show that the body can become a prison and that violence can become preventable, right? And this is what I was saying before, right? A lot of people who are injured while doing work for the gang, for the Divine Knights in this particular case, after they've injured, they become a really powerful message, right? Not only what they're saying, not only their narratives and how they tell, how they speak about their gang activities, but also in the way they represent this sort of prison, right? And they are sort of in between, right? If we talked at the beginning about how when we think about gang violence, we often think about prison or death, right, as the two options, right? And disability is often overlooked and not really considered. When we see someone in a wheelchair, like the people that Ralph is describing, right? When we see someone in this situation because of gang violence, then we sort of see that they're sort of dead and in a prison, right? And that's what Ralph wants to emphasize, how they are moving away from the medical model of disability and drawing attention to their bodies as not only the medium but also part of the message. And the other side of disability has to do with debt and obligation, right? So here's where Ralph is talking about this idea, right? Why is it that Kimo, the gang leader, is allowing Justin to talk about the risk of being in a gang, right? When Kimo wants people to join the gang, he's actively allowing Justin to talk against his message, right? Why is it? And Ralph wants to say that this is a form of debt exchange, right? That in a way Kimo owes Justin something because of the way in which Justin became disabled, right? And you'll have to read that passage to understand what I'm talking about. But basically, thinking about these relationships, right, of disability as being part of who owes something to the gang, and to whom does the gang owe something. In the same way, right, Ralph wants to talk about disease in Eastwood, and he wants to think about this idea of redemption, right, and injury. In this includes people who are HIV positive, sort of allows for a rebirth that has to do with this renegade will, right? With this idea that you need to be disciplined to survive, right? That you need to follow specific medical regimes that are very, very strict, and that show that as opposed to reckless will, you're showing a sort of renegade will, right? You're not allowing yourself to die. And he wants to say that this is something that we also see in this form of dance that's called footworking, that you can look up if you don't know what that is. And what I was saying, right, when we're thinking about renegade will and HIV, it's not only about personal transformation, but also about this rigor that has to do with managing an injury, a disease, that cannot be avoided because of the social context, right? And just to finish up this PowerPoint, I want to think about the way in which Eastwood, right? So when we talk about ethnography, we've talked about different places, right? And I've tried to emphasize how different places, even if we're talking about a neighborhood or a particular town, they're all connected to the world in different ways, in unequal ways, right? And this is something that I want you to take out of Laurence Ralph's ethnography, right? Even though Eastwood is a neighborhood in Chicago, right, it is connected to a long history of African American people migrating to different parts of the US, right, and how they were received. It is also connected to global drug trafficking, right, like when he's talking about the Taliban and how the US imposed heavy restrictions on the Taliban, and how later on this created a movement where more heroin was being distributed in Chicago. Let's also talk about the music industry, right? He has a chapter on hip hop, where he's talking about different ways in which hip hop is validated, right? And he wants to say that Eastwoodians are highly susceptible to experience injury and extremely likely to enact it, right? But he's not condoning violence. Rather, Ralph is asking us to think about violence as something that is not reducible to the individual or to psychological traits, and that is not reducible to violent acts, right? That goes beyond that, and that can be seen in the injuries that he's describing for the city, for the infrastructure, for the social world where Eastwood is.